Greetings, this is Father Brendan Helms, priest in charge of St. Monica's Anglican Church. We're going to be continuing with our series on classical theism as it relates to worship, specifically worship in the traditional Mass. So our starting point for today is something very basic that hopefully we all can connect with, and that is that we as humans very simply see the world through our senses. We touch things, we see things, we smell things, we hear and we taste our entire environment. That's how we come to know things. Through coming to know things, one of the most obvious things that we recognize about anything and everything that we have come to know directly through our senses is that things begin to exist and eventually those things end to exist. So clearly, all that we know about the things that we encounter are what we call contingent beings. Now, by contingent beings, I mean that these things do not have to exist. So the question becomes that if every being that exists was a contingent being, it follows that every single being that exists begins to exist. But, and this series isn't meant to be an argument for the existence of God, but it at least has to be touched on as it relates to classical theism. You see, if every being that exists begins to exist, we run into what we call an infinite regress of beings that require a cause to their existence. And we know from modern cosmology and from various philosophical arguments that our universe isn't eternal. So it isn't possible to have an infinite line of contingent beings. Thus, we need a necessary being. In the famous words of St. Thomas Aquinas, and this being is what we call God. A necessary being has no cause. A necessary being simply exists without a cause. So what does all this have to do with classical theism? You see, God being the necessary being is a fundamental tenet of classical theism. And so many other tenets of classical theism are going to follow from it. Here's the first key idea. You see, if God is the necessary being, not only does no other thing cause God to exist, but he also doesn't cause his own existence. It's not possible. This means that God must be existence itself. God doesn't have existence or being like you and me, but he is existence or being. The traditional Latin term for this thought is ipsum esse subsistens. You see, this way of thinking of God is not only sound in terms of philosophical theology, but it's also biblical. We see in Genesis 1 that God created everything besides himself. God tells Abraham, I am who I am. In the original Hebrew, the phrase speaks very directly to God being the uncaused cause of everything and the being that simply exists. We've already said that we are contingent beings and that God is being itself. It's also important to note at this juncture that we as contingent beings participate in God's existence. So not only do we not necessarily exist, but your act of existence is a participation in God's existence. You see, we as creatures are completely dependent upon him. This, and we'll get to this later in the series, should drive the way we worship God in the Mass. In essence, you owe God everything in terms of your existence. So it makes sense that God would have expectations of us related as to how we worship him. And this is exactly what we see in the Old Testament, as God is very clear to the ancient Jews how they are to worship him. And there's no doubt in the early church, they saw this expectation most clearly revealed in the celebration of Holy Eucharist. So given that you owe God everything, that God does have expectations of us in matters of religious obligations, it is most fitting that we worship God in the traditional Mass handed down from the fathers of the Church over the last 2,000 years as often as we possibly can. Thank you. God bless.